Uh, so this is a paper on whether liberalization promotes competition. It studies outcomes in the product market in an economic environment where there's a number of changes. Domestic deregulation in terms of entry, trade liberalization, liberalization of FDI, other policy changes that we might be interested in as well, and in addition, technological changes that might be taking place in the background. The goal is to essentially study two things. One is changes in the size distribution of firms. The second is to study the changes in the extent of competition. And the paper makes a nice attempt to kind of relate its findings to recent theoretical literature on heterogeneous firms in open economies. Let me say a couple of words about that literature, and then I'm going to come back to the links between the findings of this paper and what this literature has to say. So we have a very well-known paper by Mellett's 2003 Econometrica paper that models heterogeneous firms that are heterogeneous in their productivity, and models what it is that trade liberalization would do to the distribution of these firms. What is important to keep in mind is that this particular paper looks at bilateral trade liberalization. So it's essentially, it's say a two-country model. Liberalization occurs in a reciprocal sense on both sides. What you end up with is some exit of firms at the bottom end in both countries, which is to say that the least productive firms following liberalization exit, but the larger firms, the more productive firms, now that they have access to these partner country markets, actually expand as a result of this liberalization. There's a follow-up paper, Melitz and Ottaviano, which Anusha has talked about a bit as well. And interestingly, what this paper considers additionally is the effect of unilateral liberalization. And as one might imagine, trade liberalization, when it's undertaken in a unilateral context, which I would imagine is closer to the Indian experiment, leads to a quite different set of outcomes in terms of the distribution of firm sizes. As in the bilateral liberalization case, one expects to see that the least productive firms exit from the market. But if it's just the one country liberalizing, as India did, then one would expect pressure even on the larger firms at the upper end of the distribution, possibly a reduction in their size, in the size of their operations. And the model offers some interesting outcomes that are not clear to see in Mellett's 2003, which is to say that it explores the difference between short and long run effects. There is the possibility of welfare losses from trade that might emerge if there's what's referred to as a delocation, which is to say that the liberalizing country now has in equilibrium in the long run a smaller number of firms in operation, while the partner country has a larger number of firms. So there's in effect, a delocation of firms away from the domestic market towards the foreign country market. And so what you end up with is the possibility that the paper talks about quite a bit in terms of welfare losses rather than welfare gains for the liberalizing country. So this is kind of the trade theory background, the way I approach this paper with these sort of theoretical frameworks in mind. Well, a little closer to me, all right. So what you have in terms of the findings of the paper are very interesting, if somewhat complex set of findings. One is that there's a reduction in the average firm size. The other is that entry seems to be taking place largely at the lower end of the size distribution. There is a nonlinear shift in the distribution of firm size, which Anusha discussed in great detail, using quantile regressions. The like, you're able to see that there is a reduction in firm size at the lower end of the size distribution, but an increase in firm size at the top end. And interestingly, that there is an increase in competition as measured, for instance, by the Herfindahl index. So how does one interpret these results? On the one hand, the reduction in average firm size is consistent with greater import competition. But import competition may, as I just mentioned, may not be consistent with increases in the size of firms at the top end. Again, in the context of the unilateral liberalization undertaken by India, we might expect that firm size should fall at the top end as well. Second, the entry of firms at the bottom end of the market is consistent with maybe reduced entry barriers, but the exit at the bottom end of the size distribution is maybe what we expect instead in the context of greater import competition, not as opposed to entry that we appear to be seeing. And so what we have are sort of essentially multiple policy changes that were implemented simultaneously, reduction in entry barriers, trade liberalization, and these give you, in fact, confounding effects on the variables of interest. I would have seen, and I would maybe framed it slightly differently, I would not have seen this exercise as much as a kind of a horse race between macro models and international trade models. Essentially, you have one model with a given market structure, and macroeconomists in the papers that you discussed have focused on particular parameters. What happens if there's a change in entry costs? And international trade economists have focused on a different parameter. What happens if there's a change in trade barriers? But in effect, the underlying structure is the same. And interestingly, what we're seeing in the Indian context is both of these policies, or a combination of these, being implemented at the same time. So to me, it was less of a question of macro versus trade, more of a question of what happens when you have these things taking place simultaneously. And so in my previous slide, when I said there's some inconsistencies here, this is not a statement about the exercise, but rather that one is seeing the more complicated effects that you get when you have simultaneously different policy variables being changed. So coming back to the Melitz paper, I actually think the findings of your analysis are rich and maybe can be fitted more closely to this paper by Melitz and Ottaviano, which does in fact allow for a simultaneous consideration of many of the variables of interest to us and to this paper, which is what happens if you reduce entry barriers, what happens if you increase market size exogenously, kind of proxy for kind of broader growth drivers in the Indian economy, what happens when you have a unilateral trade liberalization, what happens maybe in other industries where possibly there were changes in trade barriers on the other side, and so bilateral trade liberalization as well. And so you're definitely within striking distance of kind of matching, taking this data to that theory, and then conducting, first of all, disentangling the effects of these different policy changes, and conducting welfare analysis as well. So I guess my one suggestion would be that the data used in this exercise are enough, sufficient to attempt a good calibration style exercise fitting the Melitz-Ottaviano model, and then disentangling the effects of the multiple policy changes and looking for sort of the overall effects on welfare as well. A related point for me was about the empirical exercises. It was not clear to me why the policy variables were not being considered simultaneously on the right-hand side. You seem to have separated industries that experienced trade liberalization, industries in which you had entry deregulation and so forth. One would imagine that you could do this together, and also that considering these simultaneously would allow you to exploit the differences between industries that only experience trade liberalization in relation to those that experience trade liberalization simultaneously with deregulation and so forth. And so you get a first-hand, a clear sense of, a better sense of the separate effects of the policy changes. I have other minor quibbles that I'll share with you privately, but the one point I wanted to make also had to do with competitiveness. So you've measured and done quite a good job looking at different variables to look at the effects of in terms of competitiveness in the product market. For example, the Herfindahl index. Now, the Herfindahl index, of course, is subject to some well-known weaknesses, For example, if you had two Bertrand firms that were selling a homogeneous good, they split the market between themselves, and so it might look like you've got a large number for the Herfindahl index. There's only two firms, and yet what you have is a competitive outcome. They're both pricing at marginal cost, and so you end up with an outcome that's equivalent to perfect competition. So alongside the measures that you've already used, my kind of a second suggestion would be maybe to use the data that's available in this data set to conduct kind of a more direct examination of kind of markups in this market, looking at kind of pretty standard decomposition of output changes into productivity changes and changes that come from changes in input growth, in which you can incorporate, as I'm sure you've seen in many exercises before, just the markup term itself, and look to see what the effects were of changes in trade, the trade regime on markups, on productivity, and so forth. So I'm going to stop there. Let me say overall that this is a very interesting paper, a very rich set of results, and I think it's within striking distance maybe of even a more ambitious, maybe a next step for you exercise, which will allow you to separate out the effects of these different policy variables and attempt some kind of welfare analysis as well.